The Mafia's Good Girl, Chapter 14. Violet's point of view. Violet let out a gasp as she pulled Damon's boxers down. This was the closest she had ever gotten to a male's reproductive organ. Violet stopped for a moment, because she wasn't sure of what to do next. When she first heard Talia's explanation of the whole plan, everything seemed simple enough. Pretend to escape, get Damon's attention so he'll come back, and have him wrapped around her finger as soon as he does. But when it was time to actually follow through, it was a different story. Violet had never done anything like this before. She suddenly felt scared and out of her element. Meanwhile, Damon just stood and watched her in silence, patiently waiting for her next move. With shaky hands, Violet then reached for Damon's member. "So this is your big plan to get me to take your virginity?" Damon said suddenly, catching her off guard. Violet looked up at him, and he let out a smirk. Suddenly, and without warning, Damon's hand grabbed Violet by her neck. She felt the air escaping her throat, and she couldn't breathe. Damon then pulled her up roughly, and Violet was powerless against him. Damon brought her face up until her lips were inches away from his. His eyes bored into her, and Violet didn't know if he was mad or happy, or maybe both. "You think it'd be that easy?" he said again, murmuring into her ear. "Please," Violet cried. "I can't breathe." Damon didn't let go of his hand right away. Violet's hand reached up and clawed against his skin, but he was relentless. Finally, after a few more seconds, Damon loosened his grip, and Violet could breathe again. She was still reeling from what just happened when Damon grabbed her face with both his hands and crashed his lips onto hers. Violet's eyes jerked open in shock. Damon's mouth was hard and rough against hers. He was powerful and dominating. He wasn't choking her, but he sucked the air out of her lungs still. When Damon felt that Violet wasn't returning the kiss, he pulled her away and stared down at her. There was a glint of disappointment in his eyes. Meanwhile, Violet was still standing there in complete and utter shock. "Looks like someone needs to be taught a lesson," Damon said lowly. In one swift move, Damon lifted her entire body up with ease and threw her down on the bed. Violet let out a shriek, and her first instinct was to get away, but Damon pinned her down completely. She was lying flat on her back, and Damon pulled her hands up above her head. He yanked his tie off his collar and tied her hands up on the bedpost. Once Violet was completely tied up, Damon took a step back to admire his handwork. Violet swallowed hard as she looked at the expression on Damon's face. She knew there was no way she could get out of this. Her little trick didn't work, and now she got herself tied up and at Damon's mercy. What is he going to do? Is he going to do it? As if to answer the question on her mind, Damon suddenly flipped her body over so she was lying flat on her stomach. Her face was flushed against the pillow, and if she didn't turn her head to the side, she wouldn't be able to breathe again. Violet saw Damon's knee dipping the bed as he leaned down closer to her. Then she felt his cold fingers running down her skin, sending shivers up and down her spine. His hand felt so big that Violet couldn't help but squirm. "Little girl, you made me miss a very important meeting today." Damon's husky voice was harsh against her ear. "So, what should we do with you?" "Damon, please." Violet tried to beg, but it only made things worse. Damon pulled his hand away, and it came back harshly against her skin seconds later. "Ouch!" Violet yelped in pain. "Does that hurt?" he asked. "Yes." "Good." Damon let out another smirk before he swung his hand against her again. Violet bit her lip to suppress the cry coming out of her throat. Damon had slapped her again right on the same spot, and her skin was stinging in pain. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she began to wonder if this was going to be the end of her. Violet scrunched her eyes shut in fear. The sound of her skin being slapped by his rough hand was hanging in the air. But the pain on her skin was nothing compared to the pain she was holding inside her stomach. "Damon, please," she begged. Tears were streaming down her face, making the pillow completely wet. "Please? What?" he taunted. "Please stop this nonsense and just take me already." Violet wanted to say those words, but her pride was getting in the way. She couldn't say anything, and she only squirmed instead. Violet was now lying on her back, and Damon climbed the bed to hover over her. His face was inches away from her, and he stopped for a minute to study her expression. He noted the tears that were dried on her face, the angry and scared look in her eyes, and how her lips were quivering. She was absolutely helpless, and Damon only smiled. It was at this moment where Violet realized how much Damon was enjoying playing mind games on people. Perhaps her virginity wasn't his intention all along. He only wanted to play the game and torture her until she breaks. Because maybe it would give him a satisfaction that was higher than sex. "Damon, please." Violet begged him for the third time that day. "Just get it over with. Please." Damon didn't answer her. She wanted to beg again, but she knew it was useless. He had no desire of giving her what she wanted. "You wanna know what you taste like?" Damon replied teasingly. He slowly climbed up her body and tilted her chin so she was facing him. Violet was absolutely spent. She had no more energy to fight him. Her gaze was dimmed and tears were pooling in her eyes. Damon kept his hand on her chin as he delved down for her lips. Violet closed her eyes instinctively, and she tasted something sweet and salty between her lips. Damon kissed her softly and tenderly this time. He took his time, and he let her taste the juices in his mouth. Then he slowly pushed his tongue into her mouth with very little resistance. Violet gave out and she let him have his way. His tongue roamed her mouth, and he tasted every corner of her. Once he was satisfied, Damon pulled away and stopped to look at her for a moment. "Such a good girl," the words came out of his mouth in a whisper. His gaze darted from her lips back to her eyes. He stared at her for the longest time, and there was even a glint of a smile playing on his lips. It seemed like he was pleased with her, and Violet felt a little bit hopeful. Maybe now he'll do it. But just as Damon was toying with her emotions all day long, he did it again this time. Before she could get any more hopeful, he suddenly pulled himself away, rolling off the bed. He stood on his feet and fixed his clothes. Violet let out a disappointed sigh because she knew it wasn't going to happen. She could only watch with blurry eyes as he walked over to the bedpost and reached for her tied-up hands. Damon was about to untie the tie, but he stopped himself for some reason. Leaning his head to the side, he thought for a moment before saying, "You know what? I kinda like seeing you like this." Damon's hands dropped to his side, and he stepped away from the bed. Violet glared at him, and her jaw fell to the ground. "Damon!" She protested and wiggled her hand to break free, but it wouldn't. "You're not seriously leaving me like this, are you?" "The maids will help you," Damon said as he headed for the door. "But..." "What?" He cut her off. Violet never used a bad word in her life, but at this moment she was thinking of all the bad words she knew in her vocabulary. She wished she could say it all to him, but she knew it wasn't going to help. It was only going to make him madder and punish her harder. "This is what you get for playing with fire, sweet girl," Damon said to her before he exited the room. "You get burned."